Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. David Cunnington. He's a specialist sleep physician delivering quality healthcare to clients with complex sleep problems and promoting sleep health through education, research and advocacy. He is co-director of the Melbourne Sleep Disorders Centre. David undertook training in sleep medicine both in Australia and in Boston at Harvard Medical School. He has an interest in drug development with a master's in medical science majoring in pharmacoeconomics, is that right? And has worked with the TGA, PBAC and industry on drug development, registration and reimbursement. David is also current clinical chair for the Australasian Sleep Association. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. David Cunnington.
Thanks very much. So Ron's really set the scene for a lot of what I want to talk about. So part of what I've got to talk about is pretty dry, to be honest, and to try to at least outline some of the rules under which we operate, or in Australia, when we're thinking about access to medications, because that helps us understand a bit about, well, what things are shiftable, what's not shiftable, where's the opportunities. And I really appreciate Ron's talk, because it highlights sort of where we've been and what some of the barriers are. So before I go into the rest of the talk, just to give a little bit of context, so as pre-mentioned, I'm currently chair of the clinical committee for the Australasian Sleep Association. So I've been in that role for about 18 months now, and part of that role is I'm really trying to push for a lot of the shifts Ron talked about from within the ASA. I sit on the board now of the ASA, and the ASA is actively working on trying to have sleep medicine as a standalone specialty. It's been working on that since 2014. And some recent events have really brought that to the fore with both APRA and the College of Physicians, so there may be an opportunity to make some inroads that we haven't been able to make inroads in previous years. I also sit on the Advanced Training Committee with the College of Physicians, and that's the committee that oversees training in respiratory and sleep medicine, and trying to do a lot of the things Ron's talked about. Both Ron and I were involved in developing the sleep medicine curriculum some years ago. We're pushing for that to be sort of one of the first waves of different physician specialties to be revised. For the college's timeline is we'll probably have the opportunity to start that process in 2023, and it'll roll through until 2025 when it rolls out. So, these things move slowly, and we have to sort of play the long game in some respects. We look for where the opportunities are, but also occasionally these little windows appear where you just go, bang, there's an opportunity and you can get something done. And Ron's had lots of good wins in the past where the stars have aligned and he's known what to do and taken an opportunity. But it is a really long game that when we're thinking about getting drugs. Okay, so this is the dry stuff. So what have you got to do to get a drug registered in Australia? And there's good and bad about getting drugs registered in Australia. The good is we've got a really robust sort of process that's designed to try and make sure that your taxpayer dollars give bang for buck in terms of paying for medications. That's the overarching intent. But before you even sort of go to that process, before you even think about sort of reimbursement and having something available that's reimbursed, you've got to get a company interested in selling the drug in Australia. They've got to be convinced they could sell enough drug to make it worthwhile. So the pharmaceutical company has to see, usually a non-Australian pharmaceutical company, has to see Australia as a viable market for a drug. So that involves developing a business case, and that's something I often get approached by companies, and others in the field will get approached by companies with a potential drug. How many people might have this disorder? How much would the government pay for it, to try and develop that sort of business case? Then they need to find a local distributor, and if that distributor decides they want to apply to get a drug registered, it's $300,000 just to put the application in. That's not the cost of preparing the application, which is many thousands of pages of documents. So you're talking a significant amount of money. Now that can be waived for orphan conditions. I'll talk a bit later about what those orphan conditions are, but you can waive that $300,000 for an orphan condition. And then you get the registration assessed, based on need and safety and efficacy. So this is the orphan definition. So the couple of key things is, one is you've got to have very good population data showing it's less than 5 in 10,000. Now we have that for narcolepsy with cataplexy. Lots of good prevalence studies with narcolepsy with cataplexy showing it's about 3 in 10,000, or 0.03% is the prevalence for narcolepsy with cataplexy. Now the trouble with IH, and I'll sort of come to it in the subsequent slide, is we don't actually know what the prevalence is. In one of Eve's first slides when he spoke this morning, he said if you take the definition being 9 hours total sleep per 24 hours plus distress symptoms, it's 1.6% of the general population have that definition. Now that's an issue in terms of, the PBAC all sort of run from that in terms of the very high prevalence for expensive drugs, but it's definitely not in that range of an orphan medication. Now, the other data Eve's quoted, which is almost in total contrast to that, is the ICSD sort of quote of it's only, IH is rare, it's 20 to 50 people per million. That for me, it just reflects a bias in the research. Narcolepsy type 1 is a great condition to research because it's defined. You can draw a fence around it. There's a key clinical symptom. And traditionally in research, there's been just a few people that people have seen that sort of fall outside that and they go, oh, maybe that's IH, and that's where you get that sort of low prevalence. But when you actually do better population studies like Eve's referred to, that's when you get to sort of 1 to 2% of the population meeting the clinical definitions of IH. So that's not going to fit within the orphan definition. Then, when you then think about getting a drug paid for, it can't be paid for unless it's registered. So you first got to get a company interested in selling the drug in Australia, make a business case, go through the process of registration, so that you've got to do that first. And then when you think about getting it reimbursed, you've got to put in a separate application. So that starts at $500,000 in terms of fees to get that assessed. And generally what the PBS will be looking at is the phase 3 clinical trials. So there'll be a pivotal clinical trial. So Eve's presented the one of the low sodium oxybate for idiopathic hypersomnia, that sort of phase 3 clinical trial. They'll look at the characteristics of the patients in that trial. So how was the disorder defined with that? And then what was the effect size? So what did you get? What's your bang for buck in terms of the treatment? And then if there's an existing drug listed on the PBS, the new drug has to either be price matched to that existing drug, or it's got to show significant benefits or a reduction in risk compared to existing drugs. And this is the problem with the lack of head-to-head studies, because a comparator can be what's previously been approved, but also in the PBS legislation, there's the wording that a comparator can be what is in use by practitioners as treatment for this disorder. So that's where IH, even though there's nothing on the PBS for IH, if we were to, say for example, go for an application to get something reimbursed for IH, there's a high likelihood the PBS would choose the comparator of being a generic psychostimulant, like dexamphetamine. We can argue all day about that's not correct, it doesn't fit with international guidelines, whatever. But the pharmacoeconomists would very much say, what's in use in the community at the moment? It would be dexamphetamine, there's your comparator. That's it. And that's tough, because dexamphetamine is cheap, really cheap. 10 cents for a 5 milligram tablet. The current approved or PBS reimbursed drug for cataplexy is clomipramine, and that's 30 cents per tablet. So anything else we come up with, unless there's significant advantages in terms of efficacy, significant reductions in terms of side effects, got to be close to that in cost. Now, just to put it in context, sodium oxybate in the US is in the order of anywhere from $70,000 US a year to over $100,000 US a year. In Australia, at cost price on a global sort of basis, it's $600 per 90-gram bottle. That's about a sort of 10-day to 20-day supply for people. And so that ain't 10 cents a tablet. It's just a whole world away from that. But in the league of drug costs in other disorders, and this is where Ron's point's really important, this is, the thinking about how much the government or society is willing to pay for sleep drugs is stuck many years ago when an expensive drug was, modafinil was thought of as an expensive drug, about $2,000 a year type of an expensive drug. Lots of drugs are now in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per year sort of range. But the thinking about the value of sleep hasn't shifted with that, and that's part of that broader sort of community discussion about not devaluing sleepiness and seeing sleepiness as actually a valid clinical symptom. Okay, now then if all that goes reasonably well, then there's another step in the process where the committee will sort of make a recommendation, yep, we can list this particular drug, but then there's negotiations with the drug company about pricing, and there'll be negotiations along the lines of government may say, well, look, we're only prepared to pay X dollars for the drug, and the company may decide, you know what, we're not going to sell it for that much because that might hurt our market in other countries where we're selling it for 10 times as much. Because another government might say, why are we paying 10 times what Australia's paying if you've agreed to sell it for this in Australia? Just a reality of the global drug market. And also the government will do volume contracts. So the government may well say to a company, well, you've told us it's only 20 to 50 per million people who have IH. Therefore, if we spend more than $20 million, for example, on this drug per year, you're going to give us the rest for free, you know, as a way of just trying to cap the total amount of expenditure. But the bit that we're really running into trouble with is leakage, and Ron alluded to that a little bit, this concept of, well, you're going to give it to everybody. You know, if we survey the Australian population, ask people how many are sleepy, that's about a third of the Australian population. And how many people feel that they're not refreshed and not satisfied by their sleep, that's about 50% of the Australian population, or 1 in 2. So if we think there's concern about leakage with narcolepsy, something we've shown as 3 in 10,000, what about concern about leakage with a disorder that's less well defined and doesn't have a clear biomarker to draw a fence around it? And if the total projected budget is more than 20 million, it needs to go to Cabinet for approval. Okay, so that's the rules. So then what I'm then going to talk about is just what I see as some of the barriers, which I've alluded to a little bit already and Ron's alluded to, and then some of the possibilities. Okay. And some of the, some of our problem, if you like, that Eves has alluded to as well. So both sleep itself is just a barometer for health. So many things in health impact with sleep, but it's exactly the same for sleepiness or inability to maintain wakefulness. So that's that lack of a specific biomarker to be able to draw a fence around what is IH. And that's part of the problem. Because in narcolepsy, we have a pretty clear disease definition, and Eve sort of addressed this. And we did some work some years ago where we did a paper when we're trying to advocate as the ASA for getting orphan status for a potential application for narcolepsy. And we showed pretty much that there's this pretty consistent prevalence of about 3 in 10,000 using the above definitions. But in IH, as it's been talked about, we don't really know what the prevalence is. And the prevalence is incredibly variable. You can pick, it depends on what you want the answer to be. You can pick your study. It'll give you the answer that you want in terms of prevalence, because there's estimates that are way more rare than narcolepsy and estimates that are way more common than narcolepsy. So the challenges that go across all the disorders include the fact that drug cost is distorted globally by the United States. Now, how is that distorted? Basically, in the United States, their drug reimbursement process is such that if a drug is licensed for a particular disorder, so it gains FDA registration, then if you've got insurance, almost always the insurance will be obliged to provide that drug for you. And so independent of cost. And the insurance companies don't have the ability to go to the manufacturer and say, well, hang on, this isn't worth $200,000 a year, we'll pay you, we're going to buy a lot of it, so we'll pay you $10,000 a year. That's not built into their legislation and been specifically part of the lobbying to prevent that being part of their legislation. Now that really distorts the global drug market. Because if you're selling a drug for $100,000 US a year in the US and you sell it for $5,000, you get offered to provide it for $5,000 a year in Australia, a lot of companies will say, well, Australia's a much smaller country, very low potential market, we'll take a pass on that. As I said, we've got those constitutional measures to prevent overpaying for medications and require the cost effectiveness, and the application process is expensive. Now, with narcolepsy, some of the particular challenges is the existence of comparators. So we have the comparative dexamphetamine, rightly or wrongly in international guidelines, it's not first line and not recommended as first line therapy, but it's defined as the existing comparator, and it's cheap. It's far from perfect, but it doesn't work too badly in most people. That's not saying it works well in everybody, far from that, but not too badly in most. And in the absence of head-to-head studies, how much, what's the trade-off? If you're paying 10 times more for modafinil, how much better is modafinil or how much safer is modafinil and dexamphetamine? We actually don't know the answers to those questions. And also, as Ron alluded to, a lot of the advice, because of these boards, both TGA approving drugs, PBS reimbursing drugs, get advice from external consultants, and a lot of the advice they get is not contemporary, not from sleep specialists. And along the line, one of the other comments was, there's plenty of drugs available for narcolepsy, and what's available works perfectly in my experience all the time. That just tells me they don't see a lot of people with narcolepsy. Now, in IH, unfortunately, the challenges are greater. As I've talked about, there's just not that clear disease definition. And if you took the disease definition used in that low sodium oxybate trial that he's talked about, that maps very closely to that population prevalence of about 1.6%. So, for example, if we wanted to go for registration, go to the PBS based on that clinical trial, it would be, okay, well, this could be used in 1.6% of the Australian population. And that's just an enormous sort of thing that would be very challenging. So yeah, what's the prevalence? If we're going to go for that sort of thing, what do we do? Which definition do we choose? How narrow do you make it? Who gets inside the tent and who gets left behind? They're really challenging decisions, and it's not up to necessarily just us as clinicians to make those decisions. It's the patient community is also going to have to be involved in that, recognising that if we try to get new, more expensive drugs approved for everybody, we may end up getting nothing for anybody. So where do you draw the line? That's a hard discussion to have, and it's challenging, but I think it's a reality. The potential for leakage, and just my last point, which thankfully is less common now, which is good, but you may know I write a fair bit online and on social media, but from about 2015 through till about 2020, I deliberately didn't publish anything about idiopathic hypersomnia, because if I wrote something about idiopathic hypersomnia online, I got trolled, basically, by different IH groups and IH individuals from around the world about, well, that's not IH, this is IH, and this is what IH is, and this is the definition. And I got enmeshed in a whole lot of this online fight I wasn't trying to be a part of and trying to actually advocate. And so I'd write about narcolepsy, not even use the term IH. Now, as a researcher and someone who advocates in this field, if you want to turn me off working for IH, that's a good way to turn me off working for IH. Now, that's changed, and it's no longer the case, and now I sort of write things and use IH in the title, and it's not the same thing, but it's important. Okay, so then what are the possibilities? So, as Ron's talked about, the parliamentary inquiry, we got some really good outcomes, but it's getting action on those outcomes. And it remains to be seen whether that does actually transpire into actions, but it does give us at least something to hang on to in terms of, you made these recommendations that included access to medications for people with narcolepsy and disorders of hypersomnolence. We're ready to pick up the baton and run with that, work with us. The other advantage is that people are mobilised and active, so patient groups. So meeting today, the work of patient groups both here in Australia and around the world, it's really positive. And professional bodies are engaged, and we really want to help to make these medications accessible. So that's good. In narcolepsy, what's potentially possible? There may be opportunities to get limited approval for new medications as second-line treatments. You know, could I see a world where we could define it, you know, come up with a definition for sodium oxybate as a second-line therapy under certain conditions? You know, I reckon I can see a pathway to that, both through registration and through reimbursement. Because you can define the patient population, there's a particular biomarker, you very carefully measure the prevalence, there's already data that the PBS has about prescriptions for dexamphetamine versus prescriptions for modafinil, so there's the ability to do sort of cost modelling and those type of things. So there may be a pathway for that. But, as Ron alluded to, there's this concern about leakage. Now, this is not new, this is from November last year. So the ASA put in a proposal to the PBS as an organisation to have the requirement for dexamphetamine being first line removed, so that modafinil could be used as first-line treatment for narcolepsy in line with the European guidelines that Eve's presented today. But essentially this was the response, and it was all concerned about leakage. There's actually no data there. That leakage is all not PBS funded. It's actually, I don't think it's as great a problem as described, but it's just this fear of leakage. And again, if that's a drug like modafinil, is a lower cost by an order of 10-fold compared to sodium oxybate in a well-defined, you know, where we're going for a narcolepsy that was really well-defined. Again, think if you're going for a broader disorder like idiopathic hypersomnia, less well-defined, and a more expensive drug. But that's where the heads, you know, the sort of the mindset or the sort of the heads are, both of advisors to the PBS and the PBS themselves. All right, so what's the possibilities in IH? Now, I thought about the first one, and I thought, it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, but at the minute there's nothing for IH. So do you say, okay, well there's an existing drug, dexamphetamine, that's already approved for narcolepsy. Do you just get that broadened a little bit for IH, so IH gets a seat at the table as a disorder that's got a drug that's approved? The downside to that is it formalises dexamphetamine as a comparator. And as Eve's talked about, and as we sort of know, we're not keen to entrench that as being first-line therapy because it goes a bit against sort of where we're trying to go. Do you apply for sodium oxybate based on the recent phase 3 clinical trial? Well, I've talked about, you know, high drug cost, loose disease definition, and if we want to try and tighten up that disease definition, who gets left out? You know, that's the difficult sort of part of the discussion as well. All right, so I've probably raised more questions than given you answers, but at least hopefully given you some understanding of sort of the framework that we've got to operate within. And we do have very different processes for both registration and reimbursement of drugs compared to other countries in the world, which is what often leads to, together with the factors Ron talked about, which are very important, leads to this difference in accessibility in terms of medications. And whilst the PBS has a lot of very positive factors, it does lead to problems getting expensive medications approved for symptomatic disorders, and particularly symptomatic sleep disorders. You know, we're sort of very much discriminated against, if you like. And very important for everyone to work collaboratively. There will be times when it's advantageous to split out narcolepsy and IH, and there'll be other times when it's advantageous to lump those things together. And we've got to recognise when it suits to do those things, right? Because there've been also examples in the past where there's been, you know, different people wanting to split them when it would have suited to lump them. You know, and each has its pros and cons, and neither way is perfect. But we have to think in each situation what's the best approach. And much like Ron, I'll be on the panel to answer questions later on today, but come and grab me at lunchtime and chew my ear or ask me any other questions you want to ask. Thanks very much.